Nearly 25 years ago, on a hot summer afternoon, I ventured into the Midwest Rare Bookshop in Mansfield, Ohio, to browse and to talk books and writers with Ernie Wesson, the knowledgeable and delightful owner. After our preliminary greetings, we adjourned to the back room. He kept his bourbon in the back room, sat down and began to talk. After telling me an anecdote about a conversation with Sherwood Anderson at the Press Club in New York in 1919, he picked up a book from a nearby table, handed it to me, and said, "Here's something I think you'll like." I did. Ernie made me a present of it, and I have it yet. It is something worth for hard usage. The book was America is West, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 1945. It was my first and perhaps the best kind of introduction to the author, John Flanagan. A quarter century later, Professor Flanagan is now Professor Emeritus, but the book remains the best collection of Midwestern literature in existence, and it is a significant introduction to its study. Professor Flanagan had already written his James Hall, Literary Pioneer of the Ohio Valley. He has since written Folklore in American Literature and a good many other books and articles on Midwestern writers and literature. Although he has ventured abroad on numerous occasions as a Fulbright and Guggenheim Fellow in Kyoto, Brussels, Moscow, and other points east and west, at the same time, his life and work have been rooted literally and metaphorically in the Midwest. A pioneer in the study of the region and literature that have given birth to this society, I think he's eminently deserving of the first MidAmerica Award for distinguished contributions to the study of Midwestern literature. Professor Flanagan.
Thank you very much.
And Professor Flanagan will have a few words, I think.
I'm a little embarrassed in coming here to begin with, since I have to admit that this is my first appearance at the meeting of the Society for the Study of Middle Western Literature. I had intention of coming along before, but various things seemed to intervene, and so I have been delayed in arriving. But I must begin by saying that I'm very, very grateful for the honor which has been bestowed upon me. And I want to thank particularly Professor Anderson and his associates for choosing me for this award. I think the Society for the Study of Midwestern Literature has been remarkably vigorous and successful. It is not the first of the regional groups formed to study segments of our national culture. The South and New England, as they historically should, have preceded us. And even in our own region, there are other groups with similar or perhaps somewhat more peripheral interests. For example, the branches of the American Studies Society and the recently organized Center for Great Plains Studies. But surely no other group has achieved so many things: a newsletter, an annual publication, several annual meetings with impressive programs, and a steadily increasing membership. The only explanation can be hard work, sincere devotion, and a valid goal. The end certainly justifies the means, and apparently the means have been found. I say that despite the interpolation in this morning's meeting about fiscal responsibility. Perhaps you might be interested in a few words about how I happened to get into a field to which I've devoted so much of my life. When I returned to the University of Minnesota in 1929, after a year of teaching in Grand Forks, North Dakota, I decided to specialize in American literature. I had never had a college course in the subject, or even a course in American history. Indeed, I wrote a master's essay upon Samuel Butler's Hudibras. The year 1929 was not a good time to start anything new, and such luminaries of the English department at Minnesota as Frederick Kleber, my Beowulf instructor, Elmer Edgar Stoll, and Douglas Bush were not exactly aficionados of American literature. Although Stoll did write a little later a very hostile article on Moby Dick. in which he lamented Ahab's attack on what he called a harmless aquatic mammal. But Minnesota did offer a few courses in the general field, and I recalled in March 1929 the first issue of American Literature, then edited by J.B. Hubble, appeared. It was also possible for me to choose an American topic for my dissertation, although I doubt that I was greatly encouraged to do so. There were indeed some proscriptions. The establishment would certainly not have accepted a regional author or a regional literary movement as a subject, nor could one select a living author. I finally chose to write on Ralph Waldo Emerson, an author of some prominence, and moreover he was safely dead. I never published the dissertation as a whole, but did extract 2 articles from it. By 1935, with my doctoral degree in my pocket, I resolved to specialize as far as I could. In those early days of the Great Depression, I never received either a fellowship or a university grant of any kind, but taught 3 sections of freshman and sophomore English, and generally read 75 to 100 themes a week. What time I could salvage I devoted to reading American books. After a rather long apprenticeship, I was given a course in Shakespeare to teach, and partially freed from reading student papers. I have nothing against Shakespeare, whom I taught rather badly, but my heart was never in Renaissance England. I never thought I was adequately prepared for the assignment. Certainly I was much happier and more at home a little later, when before leaving Minnesota, I offered courses in the American essay and in the Midwestern literature. This is not the time or the place for an elaborate autobiographical statement, but I should like to mention a few factors which I think influenced me both in teaching and research. 2 books appeared in the 1920s which attracted my attention. One was Ralph Leslie Russ's Literature of the Middle Western Frontier, published in 1924. Russ's book was perhaps overly ambitious, and it had definite limitations. The terminal date in its coverage was 1840, and it included material, journalism, theology, handbooks for travelers, political orations, which certainly had small aesthetic value. Even when Russ began his research, such names as John Mason Peck, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, William D. Gallagher, and Daniel Drake were not on everybody's lips. But Russ did confirm the point that the Middle West had a literature, even if the definition of the term was somewhat limited. The other book in question was Dorothy Dondery's The Prairie and the Making of Middle America, published in 1926. Here again the reader noted some certain oddities. The prairie suddenly became the whole Mississippi Valley, and the scope of the book was not confined to the 12 states, which we normally think of today as the Middle West. But both these volumes, erudite and meticulous, call attention in a commanding way to the important regional literature of the United States. The only major trouble with them was that they were terrifyingly comprehensive. Russ's book appeared in 2 volumes, the second of which included a bibliography of 324 pages. This was in 1840, remember. I mean, the terminal date for the book was 1840. And his study, I repeat, had a terminal date of 1840. My first intention was to write a continuation of Russ's work on the same scale, but I soon found this was unrealistic, and so my magnum opus, like Sinclair Lewis's labor novel, was never written. There were some other influential personal factors or experiences too. In the early 1930s, J. Christian Bay was still the librarian of the John Crerar Library in Chicago's Loop. Bay was a Danish immigrant who had conceived a passion for the literature of travel and exploration in the American West, and he built up an impressive collection of such works. I should interpolate that Bay's family had no interest in the library, so far as I could determine, and the library was afterwards scattered in various other institutions of the country. Probably his 3 little volumes, 3 handfuls of Western books, as he called them, published 1936 to 1938, in which he commented on and described the contents of part of his library, are still familiar. I wrote an essay for the Minnesota Alumni Weekly, pointing out the deficiencies of the University of Minnesota Library in the American field. And I remarked that one of the books the collection did not have was Joseph Kirkland's Zuri, The Meanest Man in Spring County, an impressive realistic novel of Illinois. Dr. Bay saw this essay somehow, sent the library a copy of Zuri, and invited me to visit him when next I came to Chicago. When I did get to the Career Library, he was extremely cordial. We talked for a while. He lamented the fact that so many young literary scholars, misled by their Eastern instructors, were still so immersed in Milton and Shelley that they had no interest or time in any writing about the Middle West. Naturally, I agreed. Then suddenly he picked up a book and asked if I owned a copy of Louis Hennepin's Travels. I had to admit that I didn't. I'm not sure I'd ever seen a copy, with the memorable plates of Niagara Falls and of a buffalo looking at an opossum and a pelican. Well, he said, "This is for you." And a little later, he walked out of his office, clutching carefully in my hand the Amsterdam 1698 edition of Nouvelle Découverte d'un très grand pays situé dans l'Amérique. Hennepin may have been a liar and a rogue, but at that time in my mind he was a great author. I still have that book. It was about this time that I first met Franklin J. Miney, publisher, student of American humor and folklore, collaborated with Walter Blair on books about Mike Fink, devoted admirer of Mark Twain, and book collector extraordinary. His library in the familiar house on LaSalle Street in Chicago was literally top-heavy with books. I had never seen a collection before, which was often 3 rows deep on broad shelves. But Franklin usually knew what he had and where he had put it. Whether he was talking about the multiple first editions of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, or the innumerable editions in varying bindings and colors of Longstreet's Georgia scenes. Like other collectors and students of literature, including Bernard DeVoto, Richard Dorson, Constance Rourke, and of course Walter Blair, I was indebted to Franklin for many courtesies and stimulated by his enthusiasm. I'm happy to say that because of our friendship, the University of Illinois acquired the Miney collection of humor and folklore, including an invaluable set of The Spirit of the Times, and subsequently the special Mark Twain collection. Another man who had much to do with my specialization in American and particularly Midwest literature was an historian, Theodore C. Blagan. I was never a student of Blagan's, but I knew him well for about 35 years. In that time he was editor of the Minnesota History, later the dean of the Graduate School of the University of Minnesota. Blagan's permanent interest was Norwegian immigration to the United States, about which subject he wrote 2 definitive volumes. But he also made Minnesota history into one of the best state historical journals. And since his interests were Catholic, he accepted for publication many articles which more conventional editors would have rejected. In 1935, he published my first essay, Thoreau in Minnesota, and subsequently others on Bayard Taylor, Edward Eggleston, Captain Marryat, Hamlin Garland, and Frederica Bramer. He also gave wide currency to the concept of grassroots history in both his own writing and his editorial practice. I have tried to acknowledge my debt to a friend and mentor in a biography which the Norwegian American Historical Association of Northfield, Minnesota will publish this summer. I suppose that another factor which influenced me, although at the time I was not overly conscious of it, was the appearance of several local writers on the national scene. I never saw F. Scott Fitzgerald, but I passed his home in Summit Avenue in St. Paul many times when I was driving to the University of Minnesota. And the scenes which he utilized in the short stories, the Winter Carnival Ice Palace, the Yacht Club at White Bear Lake, the St. Paul suburbs, were quite familiar. Years later I discovered that for a short time in the early 1900s, he courted a young lady who eventually married my cousin. I cannot say that I ever knew Sinclair Lewis either, but I did see him on the Minneapolis campus during the year when he taught an occasional class in writing. He attracted a mixed following of undergraduates, teaching assistants, and townspeople, and stories about his erratic behavior circulated around. I do recall the almost constant rumor that Lewis was at work on a novel dealing with a state university, a novel, by the way, which, like his labor novel, was never written, and various faculty members were uneasy that they might be used as models. A few other names come to mind too. I remembered long afterward that Harrison Salisbury, the well-known correspondent of the New York Times, was a fellow student, and he created a writing course with me. I didn't teach it, I was a student in the class. During my tenure on the University of Minnesota faculty, both Max Schulman and Thomas Hagen were undergraduates, but not my students. Frederick Manfred, who originally signed his books as Fica Ficama, was trying desperately to become a novelist, to write about his beloved Siouxland, but spent some critical years in a tuberculosis sanitarium. He appeared infrequently on the campus. Grace Flandreau and Margaret Calkin Banning won some success as writers of popular fiction, but missed genuine literary distinction. Mabel Seeley had a loyal following among detective story writers, and almost always chose Minnesota small towns for her settings. Laura Cray, at that time the wife of a prominent professor of history at the University of Minnesota, wrote several novels about her native Texas, which won a warm reception. And Carol Brink, the wife of a professor of mathematics, was a widely known writer of children's stories. I should not forget either that for a brief time Robert Penn Warren and I were colleagues at the English department of the University of Minnesota, and I knew Red Warren well. He was just beginning his career as poet and novelist, and he was a hard-working and quite successful teacher of writing. Personally, I found him quite charming, though I sometimes had trouble in understanding his Kentucky accent, which even the Rhodes Scholarship did not eliminate. I might conclude by remarking that I have taught courses in Middle Western literature in 4 different institutions: University of Minnesota, Southern Methodist University, Indiana University, and University of Illinois. I have also conducted dissertations on such Midwestern authors as Edgar Lee Masters, Mark Twain, Rachel Lindsay, Ole Edvard Rølvaag, Sherwin Anderson, Frederick Hoffman, Ruth Sukko, and Ernest Hemingway. Today there are newer Midwestern figures who demand similar attention. Writers like Gwendolyn Brooks, Nelson Algren, Willard Motley, James Farrell, perhaps a study in persistence, Frederick Manfred, William Maxwell, James Jones, Louis Bronfield, Paul Engel, and of course our newest Nobel laureate, Saul Bellow. Perhaps we should take to heart Sherwood Holmes's favorite admonition to Dr. Watson: the game's afoot. Thank you very much. And thank you again.
And now we turn to our annual presidential address. The man in the moment is Jerry Nemanic, whom I'm sure all of you know. And Jerry is going to finish what occurs here on the program as that detestable Morass. Jerry.
When I sent Dave the topic for the address, I entitled it "That Detestable Morass, That Intolerable River," and I noticed on the program, due to lack of space, it came out simply as "That Detestable Morass." And Paul greeted me this morning and he said, "Oh, you're going to talk about your bibliography." But no, indeed, it has nothing to do with the bibliographical guide to Midwestern literature, but instead it comes from Dickens, Charles Dickens' American Notes, and is apropos of his visit to the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers at Cairo. And he says it of the Mississippi River, that detestable morass, that intolerable river, and I will quote that at greater length in a moment. But what with preparing the bibliographical guide to Midwestern literature, especially the section on descriptive narratives by travelers, I thought I might share some of the more humorous negative comments of foreigners and Easterners about the Midwest. And as Dave said, what with more than 400 members in the society now, which is almost battalion strength, perhaps the Society for the Study of Midwestern Literature can afford itself to share in the amusement afforded by some of these commentaries. I've broken down, I'm going to give you some quotations from a few travelers to the Midwest, mostly concerning the manners and domestic life of Midwesterners in the frontier period, but a few that come from a later period of the 20th century, and also a comment or two on literature and language in the Midwest. And most of this material comes from the 19th century, but we've had travelers in the 20th century too, and I'll give them a little bit of due as I go along. The first person I want to mention is Zara Hawley. Not too many of you know much about Zara Hawley, I'm afraid, and he was born in 1781, apparently in Connecticut, and educated at Yale, and was a physician by profession. At 40 years of age, in the early 19th century, undertook an extended journey across New England and New York to Ohio, where in Ashtabula County, which is in the northeastern corner of the Western Reserve, he remained during 1820 and 1821. And he comments in his book, A Journal of a Tour, which was published in 1822, about some of the manners of people in Ashtabula County, Ohio. He says, first of all, that on September the 30th of 1820, I crossed the state line and entered Ohio, the fabled region of the West. I say fabled region because much more has been said about the state than has any foundation in truth. It has been compared to Canaan and even extolled above it. It has been called the Garden of America, and many other high-sounding titles have been given to it. He goes on then to describe what he found there in Ashtabula County. One of the things he describes is the houses of the people in this region, which apparently were houses which had two rooms, but rooms that were separated by a kind of hall in the center. The two rooms weren't connected, but to go from one room to the other, you had to actually go outside and go back into the other room. Of course, what was in the middle he describes as follows. He says, most of the log houses which have two rooms more resemble two houses standing near to each other and covered by one roof than one house, having a space of about 6 feet between them, so that in passing from one to the other, you have always to go into the open air, which everyone might imagine to be very pleasant and comfortable, especially in a cold, stormy winter night. In this hall, in between the two rooms, are usually placed the swill barrel, tubs, pots, kettles, etc., and here the hogs almost every night dance a hornpipe to a swinish tune, which some one or more musicians of their own number play upon the pots and kettles, while others regale themselves at the swill barrel and add to the music by upsetting it, which produces liquid music by the discharge of its contents into the hall. To this music the whole assembly join in a grunting chorus. Now the whole assembly leave their dancing and repair to the feast, which is widely and profusely spread upon the ground. So much for houses of Ashtabula County, Ohio. He also goes on to mention some interesting things about residencies in general in this part of the country in the 1820s. He says, I will finish by giving you some account of the titled men and their habitations. In riding through the country, you come to a log or block house. On inquiring to whom it belongs, you are surprised to hear that it belongs to Judge so-and-so. The whole establishment consists of one room in which all the family, with their guests, eat, sleep, and perform all the domestic operations. You proceed a little farther and arrive at a similar mansion and are informed that it belongs to Esquire so-and-so, who you find is a miller, and a man who has no other advantage for acquiring information than an ordinary school education. Soliciting information respecting another residence, you are told that it is the property of a representative or a senator of the legislature of the state of Ohio. In this villa, containing also but one room, is found a bed in 2 corners, in another a cupboard, in the fourth a swill barrel, and on one side of the room a wooden clock without a case, and by one window a 3-cornered piece of a looking-glass set in a wooden frame of domestic manufacture, and on the other side may be seen the Major so-and-so at work at shoes. You will find another similar residence belonging to the colonel of such a one. These things are all well enough, says Hawley in conclusion, but if such are the residents of the honorable, what must be those of the vulgar? And of the men who live in these houses, he says as follows. He says, 2 days ago I was conversing with a gentleman who was lately Justice of the Peace in Ashtabula County, respecting the state of society and morals, who remarked to me that when he was on the grand jury about 2 years since, that it was proved before them that there were in this county 28 men married to women here who had left their wives living in the eastern states. And afterwards he learnt that there were a number more that they did not know of at that time. So that probably, says Hawley, the number of men living in this state of adultery may not be less than 50. You will remark that the population of this county, according to the census of last year, is less than 7,200. Ebenezer Deming, I might mention in passing, who wrote under the pseudonym of Major Walter Wilkie, in 1839, 18 years after Hawley's book, appeared a very curious pamphlet called Western Emigration, a narrative of a tour to and 1 year's residence in Edensburg, Illinois, by Major Walter Wilkie, an honest yeoman of Mooseboro, state of Maine. This work ridiculed New Englanders foolish enough to consider moving to the West, and began heartily by answering the query of an old Maine neighbor once Wilkie or Deming has gone back to Maine. His neighbors, of course, asked him what his trip to Illinois was like and his experience there, and he begins his book with the following answer about his travels. He says, "Yes, fellow traveler, I have been to Illinois, and as good luck would have it, after a 12 months miserable, half-starved residence in that famous and thriving city of Edensburg, so-called, the Major has, speaking of himself, with a whole skin, but with precious little flesh, I assure you, providentially escaped, and is thus far back again to his good old native state of Maine. And what, do you ask, has your year's residence in that highly extolled country produced you? Just what you might expect, by ocular demonstration, honest friend. A broken-down wagon, a broken-winded horse, a broken-hearted wife, a broken-legged dog, and what is still more to be lamented, the irreparable broken constitutions of my 3 sons, Jonathan, Jerry, and Joe. Ah, the Major by sad experience can now truly say to you and to every other son of New England who have a good home and don't realize it, a trip to the West will teach you to prize it." Not to neglect the fair state in which we find ourselves today, let me mention briefly the classic work of Carroll and Kirkland, A New Home, Who'll Follow, which was published in the same year Deming's book was, in 1839. Kirkland moved to the east from Detroit with her husband in 1835, and then in 1837 settled at Pinckney, Michigan, about 20 miles from Ann Arbor. And there she observed the curious habits of the natives. In regards table manners, she observed with interest the activities of her housekeeper, a Mrs. Jennings, as follows. Let's see if I can get this now. She says, "When Angeline, her earlier house girl, left me, which she did after a few days, I was obliged to employ Mrs. Jennings to chore around, to borrow her own expression. And as Mr. Clavers was much absent much of the time, I had the full enjoyment of her delectable society with that of her husband and 2 children, this being the housekeeper, who often came to meals very sociably and made themselves at home with small urgency on my part. The good lady's habits required strong green tea at least 3 times a day, and between these 3 times she drank the remains of the tea from the spout of the teapot, saying it tasted better so. If she hadn't it, she said, she had the sterix, so that she wasn't able to do a chore, and her habits were equally imperious in the manner of dipping with her own spoon or knife into every dish on the table. She would have made out nobly on kebabs," says Kirkland, "for even that unwieldy morsel A boiled ham she grasped by the hock and cut off in mouthfuls with her knife, declining all aid from the carver and saying coolly that she made out very well. It was in vain one offered her anything, says Kirkland. She replied invariably with a dignified nod, "I'll help myself, thank you. I never wanted no waitin' on." And this reply is the universal one on such occasions, as I have since had vexatious cause to observe. Let no one read with an incredulous shake of the head, she says, but rather let my sketch of these peculiar habits of my neighbors be considered as a mere beginning, a shadow of what might be told. I might, she says, amaze indeed the very faculty of eyes and ears. She goes on to talk about the borrowing and lending habits of the populace. I noticed a number of the early travelers in the Midwest particularly remarked on how people in the Midwest were prone to borrow and lend materials at the drop of a hat. She is also fond of little epigraphs to each chapter, and to this one on borrowing and lending, she quotes Shakespeare, "Lend me your ears," and also Bacon's, "Grant graciously what you cannot refuse safely," and goes on this way. A little 6-year-old girl from the neighborhood, the Howard family, comes into the Kirkland cabin and says, "Mother wants your sifter," said Miss Ianthe Howard, a young lady of 6 years' standing, attired in a tattered calico, thickened with dirt, her unkempt locks straggling from under that hideous substitute for a bonnet, so universal in the Western country, a dirty cotton handkerchief, which is used ad nauseum for all sorts of purposes. "Mother wants your sifter, and she says she guesses you can let her have some sugar and tea too, 'cause you've got plenty." This excellent reason, says Kirkland, "'cause you've got plenty," is conclusive as to sharing with your neighbors. Whoever comes into Michigan with nothing will be sure to better his condition. But woe to him that brings with him anything like an appearance of abundance, whether of money or mere household conveniences. To have them and not be willing to share them in some sort with the whole community is an unpardonable crime. You must lend your best horse to go 10 miles over hill and marsh in the darkest night for a doctor, or your team to travel 20 after a gal. Your wheelbarrows, your shovels, your utensils of all sorts belong not to yourself, but to the public, who do not think it necessary even to ask a loan, but take it for granted. The 2 saddles and bridles of Montacute, the town, spent most of their time traveling from house to house, a man back, and I've actually known a stray martingale to be traced to 4 dwellings 2 miles apart, having been lent from one to another without a word to the original proprietor, who sat waiting not very patiently to commence a journey. Then within doors, an inventory of your plenishings of all sorts would scarcely more than include the articles which you are solicited to lend. Not only are all kitchen utensils as much your neighbor's as your own, but bedsteads, beds, blankets, sheets travel from house to house, a pleasant and effectual mode of securing the perpetuity of certain efflorescent peculiarities of the skin, for which Michigan is becoming famous, she says. Of course, most of us assume that the manners of Midwesterners is much improved in the 20th century, although many of us who live in Chicago have had the experiencing of mentioning this fact abroad or even in Tennessee, only to have our conversant blanch and begin to look us over attentively as if seeking the telltale signs of bullet holes, or the wild vacant stare of one who's recently returned from Conrad's Heart of Darkness. To wit, then, G.K. Chesterton's wonderful remarks on visiting Chicago in 1931. Chesterton wrote this little piece for Time magazine and entitled it "The Gunman and the Racketeer." And he goes on thus. He says, "When we say that this is the age of the machine, that our present peace, progress, and universal happiness are due to our all being servants of the machine, we sometimes tend to overlook the quiet and even bashful presence of the machine gun. But the machine gun has been overcoming its shyness of late and has been persuaded to figure in a field where it was never seen before. In one sense, of course, the machine gun is, like many modern things, so familiar as to become almost old-fashioned. Governments have long used it, of course, against barbarians so brutal and ignorant as not instantly to surrender their own mines or oil fields to the foreign millionaires who govern most of the governments. So an early poem of Mr. Belloc summed up forever the moral qualities that make for world mastery and the really essential virtues of a conquering race. I quote, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not." But an entirely new development has appeared in America, says Chesterton, and especially in Chicago. It consists of the organized use of machine guns by the ordinary criminal classes. The millionaires, of course, were not members of the criminal classes. They were only criminals without the redeeming weakness of class consciousness. But it really does mark rather an interesting phase in history, he says, that Bill Sykes, the coarse and common burglar of our boyhood dream, is no longer defending himself with a pistol, but with a park of artillery. I do not mean to be at all Pharisaic about Chicago. It has many beauties, including the fine fastidiousness and good taste to assassinate nobody except assassins. Criminal society in Chicago seems to be extraordinarily exclusive, and it is impossible for any mere journalist or traveler to penetrate into the best circles or receive an invitation to be taken for a ride, a hospitable formula for death, by the true leaders of fashion. While I was in Chicago, a very distinguished individual had the misfortune to be murdered, being caught between the fire of 2 machine guns and falling with a ton of lead in him. But as I gather that the same gentleman had himself murdered no less than 34 persons in exactly the same way, it was impossible to feel that any advantage had been taken of his innocence and youth, or that he had been lured into a game of which the rules had not been explained to him. It is not every town in the world that has this strict segregation and close corporation of crime. Rather, as the art for art's sake school used to maintain that only artists should criticize artists, so these refined gunmen feel that only murderers are competent to condemn murderers. I wish there were a similar rule in other towns by which only cheats should be cheated, only swindlers should be swindled, and only usurers should be ruined and sold up, as there is in this elegant conception that only killers should be killed. I ought to add here, however, says Chesterton, that quite lately, I believe within the last few years, there's been a new violation of this virginal isolation of the artists in crime, a new method called racketeering. It seems for some mysterious reason to be applied especially to beauty parlors, which are now very nearly the national industry of America. A gentlemanly stranger enters the shop and asks the shopkeeper whether he wishes his business to succeed. The shopkeeper replies that such was indeed his purpose, paradoxical as it may seem in opening the shop. The stranger then says, "You will leave so many $1,000s on the counter this afternoon," and disappears. If the shopkeeper neglects this advice, his shop is blown up. It seems simple, says Chesterton. I cannot quite understand why it is not done everywhere. If it can be done anywhere, but anyhow, he says, it is another step outside the self-contained society of mutual murder, and such regrettable. He says a first member of the FFCK, or First Family of Chicago Killers, should not stoop to associate with people who run beauty parlors. As a mere matter of romance and sentiment, I should be relieved if most of the beauty parlors were blown up. But I draw the line when there are people inside them. Perhaps people are blown up in the very act of being beautified. He says it would lend a new and impressive meaning to facelifting. I want to mention also briefly, very briefly, the visit of Rudyard Kipling to Chicago, which was made in 1906. Kipling hated Chicago, hated most of America, and entitled his essay, "How I Struck Chicago and How Chicago Struck Me," of religion, politics, and pig-sticking, and the incarnation of the city among shambles. His little poem, which precedes the essay, "I know thy cunning and thy greed, thy hard high lust and willful deed, and all thy glories love to tell of specious gifts material." And he goes on to describe shortly the city of Chicago. "I have struck a city," says Kipling, "a real city. They call it Chicago. The other places do not count. San Francisco was a pleasure resort as well as a city, and Salt Lake was a phenomenon. This place, Chicago, is the first American city I have encountered. It holds rather more than 1 million people with bodies and stands on the same sort of soil as Calcutta. Having seen it, I urgently desire never to see it again. It is inhabited by savages. Its water is the water of the Huli, and its air is dirt. Although I say that it is also it says that it is the boss town of America. I do not believe, says Kipling, that it has anything to do with this country. They told me to go to the Palmer House, which is a gilded and mirrored rabbit warren, and there I found a huge hall of tessellated marble crammed with people talking about money and spitting about everywhere. This couldn't have been during an MLA convention, I'm sure. Other barbarians charged in and out of this inferno with letters and telegrams in their hand, and yet others shouted at each other. A man who had drunk quite as much as was good for him told me that this was the finest hotel in the finest city on God's almighty earth. By the way, when an American wishes to indicate the next county or state, he says, God Almighty's earth. This prevents discussion and flatters his vanity. He managed also, Kipling, to visit in Chicago a church on Sunday morning service, which he relates thusly. He says, Sunday brought me to the queerest experience of all, a revelation of barbarism complete. I found a place that was officially described as a church. It was a circus, really, but that the worshippers did not know. There were flowers all about the building, which was fitted up with plush and stained oak and much luxury, including twisted brass candlesticks of severest Gothic design. To these things and a congregation of savages entered suddenly a wonderful man, completely in the confidence of his God, whom he treated colloquially and exploited as much as a newspaper reporter would exploit a foreign potentate. But unlike the newspaper reporter, he never allowed his listeners to forget that he, and not he, was the center attraction. With a voice of silver and with imagery borrowed from the auction room, he built up for his hearers a heaven on the lines of the Palmer House, but with all the gilding real gold and all the plate glass diamond, and set in the center of it a loud-voiced, argumentative, and very shrewd creation that he called God. One sentence at this point caught my delighted ear. It was apropos of some question of the judgment day and ran, "No, I tell you, God don't do business that way." He was giving them a deity whom they could comprehend, in a gold and jewel heaven in which they could take a natural interest. He interlarded his performance with the slang of the streets, the counter, and the exchange, and said that religion ought to enter into daily life. Consequently, I presume he introduced it as daily life, his own and the life of his friends. I couldn't resist including one brief comment on the Midwestern literary scholar, circa 1827, as observed by Mrs. Frances Trollope. She relates this literary conversation at the home of the editor Timothy Flint in Cincinnati, in her 1827 book, The Domestic Manners of the Americans. She'd gone to the Flint home a number of times and was entranced by Mr. Flint. On one occasion, she said, I passed an evening in the company with a gentleman said to be a scholar and a man of reading. He was also what is called a serious gentleman, and he appeared to have pleasure in feeling that his claim to distinction was acknowledged in both capacities. There was a very amiable, serious lady in the company to whom he seemed to trust for the development of his celestial pretensions, and to me he did the honor of addressing most of his terrestrial superiority. The difference between us was that when he spoke to her, he spoke as to a being who, if not his equal, was at least deserving high distinction, and he gave her a smile such as Michael might have vouchsafed to Eve. To me, he spoke as Paul to the offending Jews. He did not indeed shake his raiment at me, but he used his pocket handkerchief so as to answer the purpose. and if every sentence did not end with "I am clean," pronounced by his lips, his tone, his look, his action fully supplied the deficiency. Our poor Lord Byron, as may be supposed, was the bull's eye against which every dart in his black little quiver was aimed. I had never heard any serious gentleman talk of Lord Byron at full length before, and I listened attentively. It was evident that the noble passages which are graven on the hearts of the genuine lovers of poetry had altogether escaped the serious gentleman's attention, and it was equally evident that he knew by rote all those that they wish the mighty master had never written. I told him so, and I shall not soon forget the look he gave me. Of other authors his knowledge was very imperfect, but his criticisms very amusing. Of Pope he said, he is so entirely gone by that in our country it's considered quite fustian to speak of him. But I persevered and named The Rape of the Lock as evincing some little talent, and being in a tone that might still hope for admittance in the drawing room. But on the mention of this poem, the serious gentleman became almost as strongly agitated as when he talked of Don Juan, and I was unfeignedly at a loss to comprehend the nature of his feelings, till he muttered, with an indignant shake of the handkerchief, "The very title." At the name of Dryden, he smiled, and the smile spoke as plainly as a smile could speak. "How the old woman twaddles." "We know only Dryden by quotations, madam," he said, "and these indeed are found only in books that have long since had their day." "And Shakespeare, sir?" I said. "Shakespeare, madam, is obscene, and thank God we are sufficiently advanced to have found it out. If we must have the abomination of stage plays, let them at least be marked by the refinement of the age in which we live." This was certainly being au courant du jour. Of Massinger he knew nothing. Of Ford he had never heard. Gray had had his day. Prior he had never read, but understood he was a very childish writer. Chaucer and Spenser he tied in a couple, and dismissed by saying that he thought it was neither more nor less than affectation to talk of authors who wrote in a tongue no longer intelligible. This, says Trollope in conclusion, was the most literary conversation I was ever present at in Cincinnati. All of which echoes a bit of Mencken's famous couplet, you know, from about the state of culture in the South. Alas for the South, her books have grown fewer. Well, she never was much given to literature, says Mencken. And since we've left Iowa unscathed, perhaps that echo might extend to a similar couplet by Ellis Parker Butler concerning the priorities of the state legislature. I don't have it exactly, but it goes something like millions and millions for hog and manure, and yet not 1 cent for literature. And finally, back full circle to that most famous of the Midwest debunkers with whom we started, Charles Dickens, who lost so much money on land speculations near Cairo, Illinois, and took it out on Mark Twain's river country with a vengeance in his classic description of his arrival at Cairo by boat. Dickens arriving at Cairo from the Ohio, of course, to the confluence with the Mississippi. He says, "The scenery as we approached the junction of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers was hardly inspiriting in its influence. The trees were stunted in their growth, the banks were low and flat, the settlements and log cabins fewer in number, their inhabitants more wan and wretched than any we had encountered yet. No songs of birds were in the air, no pleasant scents, no moving lights and shadows from swiftly passing clouds. Hour after hour the changeless glare of the hot, unwinking sky shone upon the same monotonous objects. Hour after hour the river rolled along as wearily and slowly as time itself. At length, upon the morning of the 3rd day, we arrived at a spot so much more desolate than any we had yet beheld, that the forlornest places we had passed were, in comparison with it, full of interest. At the junction of the 2 rivers, on ground so flat and low and marshy that at certain seasons of the year it is inundated to the housetops, lies a breeding place of fever and death. Vaunted in England, this country of Cairo and the prairies, as a mine of golden hope, and speculated in on the faith of monstrous representations to many people's ruin. And of course this was Dickens' own problem. A dismal swamp on which the half-built houses rot away, cleared here and there for a space of a few yards, and teeming then with rank, unwholesome vegetation, in whose baleful shade the wretched wanderers who are tempted hither droop and die and lay their bones. The hateful Mississippi, circling and eddying before it, and turning off upon its southern course, a slimy monster hideous to behold, a hotbed of disease, an ugly sepulchre, a grave uncheered by any gleam of promise, a place without one single quality in earth or air or water to commend it. Such is this dismal Cairo. But what word shall describe the Mississippi, great father of rivers, who, praise be to heaven, has no young children like him? An enormous ditch, he says, sometimes 2 or 3 miles across, running liquid mud 6 miles an hour. We drank the muddy river of this water while we were upon it, says Dickens. It is considered wholesome by the natives, and is something more opaque than gruel, he says. And finally, from which the quote itself comes, in good time, this is after a trip to one of the prairies and then a return to Cairo. He says, in good time next morning, however, we came again within sight of the detestable morass called Cairo, and stopping there to take in wood, lay alongside a barge whose starting timbers scarcely held together. It was moored to the bank, and on its side was painted Coffee House, that being, I suppose, the floating paradise to which the people fly for shelter when they lose their houses for a month or two beneath the hideous waters of the Mississippi. But looking southward from this point, we had the satisfaction of seeing that intolerable river, dragging its slimy length and ugly freight abruptly off toward New Orleans. And passing a yellow line which stretched across the current, we were again upon the clear Ohio, as they're coming back up now towards up the Ohio River. Never, I trust, to see the Mississippi more, saved in troubled dreams and nightmares, leaving it for the company of its sparkling neighbor, who was like the transition from pain to ease, or the awakening from a horrible vision to cheerful realities. And with that, let us return to the more cheerful realities of dessert and coffee, or whatever is left, and also the good papers that are going to be afforded us this afternoon, and also later to be afforded libations of some sort at the Andersons in Dimmondale. Well, thank you. I'll see you again later.